The sun had long since set, but in the small hotel room, Jack Harper sat alone, staring blankly out the window. He barely registered the darkness creeping in outside, the city lights flickering like distant ghosts. A cold breeze slipped through, the crack in the window making the curtain flutter, a silent omen. He tightened his grip around the whiskey glass, but the bitter taste did nothing to clear his mind. Today was supposed to be a special day. Not because of work, because of what he had just discovered. It had started when Sarah came home late. Her silhouette, once graceful and familiar, now carried a distant, almost indifferent aura. She didn't greet him with a kiss, didn't even offer an apology. Instead, she simply uttered 4 words that sent his world crumbling. "I have to go, Jack." And just like that, something shifted. They had been a family, a happy one, or so he had thought. But as Sarah moved past him without a second glance, Jack felt something cold settle in his chest. And then she said it, her voice devoid of hesitation, almost casual. "I have a date with Lucas. He's waiting for me." For a moment, his breath caught in his throat. Lucas King, the head of the law firm where Sarah worked. Jack had never liked him. The man was arrogant, too self-assured, and had always seemed a little too interested in Sarah. Jack had ignored it, dismissed his own insecurities, but now there was no denying it. Sarah was leaving. Jack stood frozen, waves of betrayal crashing over him. He wanted to believe there was some explanation, some reason that would make sense of it all, but there wasn't. The truth was clear that he was someone else. He watched as Sarah put on her coat, her movements smooth, almost rehearsed. She didn't even look at him before walking out the door. The sound of her heels clicking against the floor echoed in the silence, each step carrying her farther away. And then she was gone. Jack sat in the empty apartment, the silence deafening, suffocating. He gritted his teeth, his hands curling into fists. He couldn't just sit here, drowning in this feeling of helplessness. He had to do something. He had to face the truth, but this time he wouldn't be the broken man left standing in the shadows. The night stretched on, endless and heavy. Jack sat with his phone in his hand, staring at Sarah's contact, his mind racing. He hadn't slept, couldn't. By morning, golden sunlight seeped through the curtains, casting long streaks across the room. Jack stood by the window, watching. Sarah, as she applied her makeup in front of the mirror, she looked the same, beautiful, poised, the woman he had once believed would always be by his side. But something had changed. There was a distance in her, a subtle coldness in the way she carried herself, the way her eyes no longer held the warmth they once had when she looked at him. Jack wanted to ask her, to demand the truth, but every time he tried, he was met with that same empty silence, or worse, a dismissive smile, as if none of this mattered. He thought back to the beginning, to the way Sarah used to be, how she had once looked at him like he was the center of her world, how she had been the person who grounded him, who made everything feel right. That woman was gone, and Jack was finally starting to accept it. The breaking point came one evening. He had decided to surprise Sarah at work, an impulsive decision fueled by a desperate need for answers. But what he saw when he walked in stopped him cold. Lucas King, he was standing too close to her. They were laughing, their bodies angled toward each other, the space between them too intimate. And then Jack saw it, the way Sarah looked at Lucas, the way she used to look at him. Something twisted deep in his chest. He wanted to storm over, demand the truth, force her to admit what he already knew. But instead he stood frozen in the doorway, his heart pounding in his ears. He didn't need to hear the words. He had seen the signs, and now there was no turning back. Jack had seen the signs before, the way Lucas always lingered around Sarah. The late-night texts that she never explained, the way he brushed against her in the office, just a little too familiar. Jack had brushed it off, convincing himself it was nothing more than friendly office banter. But now he could no longer deny it. Something was happening between them, something Jack wasn't a part of. And worst of all, he had no idea how long it had been going on. That night, Jack returned home, his mind swirling with 1,000 thoughts. He sat in the living room, staring at the empty space across from him where Sarah usually sat. But it felt like she wasn't there anymore. Not really. Jack knew deep down that the time had come for him to face the truth, even if it meant losing everything. Sleep never came. Even as the morning light streamed through the window, Jack remained awake, his thoughts running in endless circles. He stood by the window, watching as Sarah applied her makeup, preparing for another day as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Jack studied her reflection carefully, noticing the small but undeniable shifts. The way she moved, the way her eyes no longer carried the warmth they once did. She was still beautiful. Still the woman he had fallen in love with. But she was different now, distant, detached. There was a wall between them, one he couldn't break through no matter how hard he tried. He wanted to ask her, demand the truth, but every time he opened his mouth, the words died before they could form. Instead, he was met with a dismissive smile or an empty silence, as if nothing was wrong. The more he reached for her, the further she pulled away. Jack thought back to the early days of their love, how Sarah had been so attentive, so full of life, how she had always made him feel like the most important person in the world. But those days felt like they belonged to someone else, like a dream he was slowly waking from. He had told himself it was just a phase, that things would get better. But deep down, he knew the truth. The breaking point came one evening. Jack hadn't planned on stopping by Sarah's office, but something in him, some desperate need for reassurance, drove him there. And that was when he saw them, Lucas King, standing too close to Sarah. Their laughter was quiet, intimate, the space between them too familiar, too comfortable. Then Jack saw it, the way Sarah looked at Lucas, and his heart stopped. There was a spark in her eyes, something Jack hadn't seen in so long. Not directed at him, at least. For a moment, he felt like he couldn't breathe. He wanted to move, to storm over, to demand answers, but his body refused to cooperate. He stood frozen in the doorway, watching the evidence unfold before him. He had seen the signs before, the way Lucas lingered, the way he texted, the way Sarah's laughter had changed when she spoke about him. Jack had ignored it all. But now, there was no denying it. Something was happening between them, something real, and Jack had no idea how long it had been going on. That night, he returned home, the weight of betrayal pressing against his chest like an unbearable weight. He sat in the living room, staring at the empty chair where Sarah usually sat, but it felt like she was already gone. And deep down, Jack knew, once he confronted the truth, nothing would ever be the same again. As Jack walked out of Lucas's office, the words of the arrogant lawyer still echoed in his mind. "You have nothing but a broken family, Jack, and I won't stop until I get what I want." The anger inside him burned hot, but something else was growing in its place. Determination. This wasn't just about saving his marriage anymore. This was about reclaiming his dignity. Lucas thought he could take everything from Jack, his wife, his family, his life. But Jack wasn't going to let that happen. He was done being the victim. With renewed purpose, he drove straight to David's office. David had been his friend for years, and now, more than ever, Jack needed him. As he walked in, David looked up, his expression shifting the moment he saw the fire in Jack's eyes.
"Lucas isn't going to go down easily, Jack," David said, his voice measured, calm. But there was a sharp edge to his words. "He has power, connections. He's not someone you can take on without a plan." Jack's hands clenched into fists. "I
Don't care. I'm not letting him destroy everything I've built." David studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Then we do this the right way. We gather everything, every piece of evidence we can find, and when the time comes—" Jack exhaled, a newfound resolve settling over him. "We make our move." This was no longer just about heartbreak. This was war. Jack held on to a sliver of hope. Maybe, just maybe, if Sarah faced the truth, she would finally see the damage she had caused. But even more than that, he knew he had to destroy Lucas's control over their lives. So he began his investigation, quietly, methodically. He followed Sarah, when she left the house, watching as she met with Lucas in secret. He spent hours combing through her phone, uncovering texts, call logs and messages, each one a breadcrumb leading to the truth he had feared for so long. And then, one evening, everything fell into place. Sarah and Lucas met at a cafe, but this time they weren't alone. A man Jack had never seen before stood nearby, watching them closely. Jack, hidden behind a parked car, held up his phone, recording every second. His heart pounded in his chest. Something about this moment felt different. As Sarah and Lucas stepped outside, their bodies brushed against each other. Lucas placed his
hand on Sarah's back, too intimate, too familiar. Jack's breath caught. This wasn't just suspicion anymore. This was confirmation. He had the video, the messages,
the proof. Jack wasn't going to stand by and watch his family be destroyed by lies and betrayal. It was time to confront Sarah, time to face Lucas, time to take back what was rightfully his. The next morning, Jack met with David again, his hand gripping his phone tightly. "This is it," he said, his voice low but unwavering. "We've got them now." David watched the footage in silence. Jack could see the shift in his friend's expression, concern melting into grim satisfaction. "This
is the proof we needed," David said. "Now we fight back." Jack nodded.
For the first time in weeks, a sense of relief mixed with his anger. He had the truth, and no one was going to take that away from him. The battle was just beginning. The courtroom, when the day of the hearing arrived, Jack felt the weight of the world pressing down on him. Despite all his preparation, stepping into the courtroom made everything real. This wasn't just about exposing Sarah and Lucas. This was about his children, his dignity, everything he had built. Jack's gaze landed on Sarah as she entered the room. She had changed. The confidence she once carried had dimmed, but there was still a coldness in her movements, a detachment. She stood there like a woman who had already accepted the consequences of her choices. Jack didn't know what she would say today. Would she show remorse, or would she lie until the very end? Then Lucas walked in. Jack's jaw tightened. Dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit, Lucas carried himself with sickening arrogance, his every step dripping with confidence. He didn't even look at Jack, but Jack felt the weight of his presence, a silent challenge, daring him to break. But Jack wasn't afraid anymore, not today. He had the truth on his side. The jury listened intently as the lawyers presented their arguments. Sarah's attorney tried to paint her as a victim, a woman caught in an impossible situation. Lucas's lawyer argued that there had been nothing immoral or illegal about their relationship. But Jack knew better. No amount of polished words could erase what had happened. Then came his turn to speak. As Jack rose to his feet, he felt an overwhelming sense of resolve. This wasn't just about a broken marriage, it was about a stolen life. It was about his children. Jack turned to the jury, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Your Honor, members of the jury," he began, "what we're talking about today isn't just a marriage, it's a family, my family. A family that I spent years building, protecting, and cherishing. And yet, that trust, that foundation, was shattered by two people who made a choice." His eyes locked on to Sarah and Lucas. Neither of them met his gaze. "Sarah, you were my partner, my wife, the mother of my children. You broke my trust, our vows, everything we built. And for what? For a man who never cared about us? For someone who thought he could take what wasn't his?" Jack turned to Lucas now, his voice sharp as steel. "You thought you could walk into my life and take everything from me. But you were wrong." A hush fell over the room. Even the judge leaned forward slightly. "Look at what you've done," Jack continued. "You didn't just betray me. You hurt our children. You tore apart the foundation
of everything we built."
He let the words hang in the air, heavy with truth. This wasn't just a courtroom battle. This was about justice. This was about proving that his life, his love, and his family were worth more than the lies Sarah and Lucas had tried to weave. Jack
Took a deep breath. He had lost many things, but he wouldn't lose this fight. Not now. Not ever. Because of power? Because you thought you could take what wasn't yours and get away with it.
Jack's voice rang through the courtroom, sharp and unwavering. The room fell into a tense silence. Sarah lowered her head, unable to meet his gaze. Lucas's face hardened, his usual smugness faltering for the first time. And in his eyes, just for a second, Jack saw something new. Doubt he was losing control. Jack took a steady breath. "This isn't just about a failed marriage," he continued, his voice filled with conviction. "This is about my family's future, my children's future, about protecting them from the damage you've caused. And I will do everything in my power to make sure they know the truth, that I fought for them no matter what." With those final words, Jack sat down. His heart pounded in his chest, adrenaline still coursing through him. The fight was far from over, but for the first time he felt free. He had spoken his truth, and the truth was all that mattered. A tense silence stretched across the courtroom. Before the trial resumed, voices rising and falling around him. But Jack no longer felt the crushing weight of uncertainty. Whatever happened next, he had made his stand. The rest was out of his hands.